Welcome to the podcast on North American Literature hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. My name is Adrienne Garcia and I will be the host of today's episode, where I will be joined by Daniela García Niorte, student of English Studies in the University of Granada. We will be discussing the influence of Margaret Fuller in Adrienne Rich regarding the depiction of women and the stylistic devices they used. Without further ado, let's welcome Daniela to the podcast. How are you, Daniela?
I'm fine, thank you.
Your research mainly focuses on two texts, one of them being Women in the 19th Century, written by Margaret Fuller. Can you tell us a little bit about its author and the content of the text?
Well, Margaret Fuller was an intellectual, a writer and a social reformer whose work occupies a central position within the American Transcendentalist movement. She engaged with key social issues of her time, including gender inequality, slavery, and education. She wrote Woman in the 19th Century in 1845, and it has been viewed as a foundational text in American feminist thought. It advocates for political, intellectual, and spiritual emancipation of women, and Fuller challenges the prevailing cultural and intellectual assumptions that confine women to subordinate roles. The text aims to make the public realize the necessity of gender equality, portraying the unfair situations that women live daily in a patriarchal society. She wanted to change the view that social relations between men and women were considered at the moment of writing.
Nice. What about Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law by Adrienne Rich?
Well, Adrienne Rich was a major figure in the 20th century American poetry and feminist thought, whose work spans over 6 decades of literary, political, and social transformation. Her work is deeply embedded in the socio-political context of the civil rights movement, second-wave feminism, and LGBTQ+ activism. Her work could be described as poetry of the actual world. It is characterized by its authenticity and the description of the real world in which women lived. Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law was a turning point in her career. This poem marks a point in her career where she started to focus mainly on women and the experience of those women in society. And it's a very experimental and politically charged territory.
Your study firstly focuses on the way that Margaret Fuller depicted women in her 1845 book. What can you tell us about this?
Well, Margaret Fuller gave a portrayal of what she thought women had to be, but she also tried to explain how men viewed women. Men have always considered women as objects that can help them in some way, and if not, they are not even considered human beings. In other words, Fuller stated that women were only capable of learning from men, and they were never equal to them, and everything they did had to be with the help of these men. But she explained that women were actually very capable human beings, just like men. So that one was one of the main points of her work, the equality between women and men. She explained that both genders should have the same rights. And she emphasized that both genders are spiritual beings with equal potential, even merging in some way. She argued that her desire was that the equality between both genders was distinctly and rationally apprehended, and the conditions of life and freedom recognized as the same for the daughters and the sons. This takes us to the freedom that women should have, more specifically intellectual freedom. Fuller considered women to be capable of having an education and having a job, whereas the patriarchal society only saw them as mothers and wives. Fuller defended this idea, which was applied to her own experience. She had many writers criticizing her and her work, but there was also some writers that admired her, like Edgar Allan Poe. She thought that everyone, despite gender, can grow up, reason, and connect with the divine, and she understood women as individuals with a soul.
And how did Adrienne Rich depict women in her poem?
Well, Rich mainly attacks the constraints that patriarchy and domesticity imposes in women. She depicts in the poem. She depicts a woman that slowly becomes conscious of the limitations she faces just for being a woman. There are many constraints that society puts on women, and one of them is the inability to use their mind, the impossibility to have intellectual freedom, just like Margaret Fuller explained. The speaker of the poem talks about the mind of the daughter-in-law as rotten and usable, which also implies the lack of ambition of the woman to escape from this situation. Rich tries to convey the image of women as only capable of staying in the house that the patriarchal society of her time imposed on women, and shows how they did not try to escape this reality, maybe because men engraved in their minds how useless and incapable of thinking and rationalizing they were. One of the most important points in the poem is the criticism of Rich to other women. Like, she tried to convey an image that what the society is also suffering from is the oppression from other women to women. She tried to portray various women lacking their own subjectivity because they lived under that discourse of the patriarchal society, and she also depicted the anger that women felt. She depicts women in the poem with different instruments that can be considered weapons, like the thinking woman being gripped by a pig. These women's weapons are not used to harm others, but they are used to hurt themselves or other women. Women are conscious of the impossibility of meeting the standards that the patriarchal society has set for them, and they direct their anger towards themselves for not being able to reach that ideal woman that men imagine.
So, would you say that both authors had a similar view on women?
Yeah, definitely. I think both of them wanted to convey an image of women being free, being intellectuals that can have their own saying and they can be as capable as men. I think what they were doing with their writings was reivindicating this freedom and this equality of women in their own spaces.
That's really interesting. In your study, you state that these authors use the same stylistic devices, that is, allusions and irony. Focusing firstly on allusions, how did both of these authors use it?
Well, firstly, allusions are the like naming other literary figures or mythological figures to demonstrate their knowledge and to reinforce their depiction of women as equal to men. In the case of Margaret Fuller, she offered a variety of conflicting views of women by including sites of various authors like John Quincy Adams, a poem of William Ellery Channing, and an essay written by Susan Necker. Another allusion important in Fuller's essay is the one referred to the classical tradition. She makes a call for liberty using the goddess of wisdom, Minerva, or the goddess of youth, Eve, both women, which is important. She mentions Apollo and Minerva, classical gods, and she also alludes to Shakespeare in different moments to illustrate her ideas about gender, virtue, and the complexities of human nature. On the other hand, Adrienne Rich alluded to some writers, both implicitly and explicitly. She mentions Emily Dickinson, a writer that lived that life that was expected at her time for a woman, but that did not stop her from writing and challenging the gender roles. Rich refers to the poem by Dickinson called My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun. Another allusion is the one to Mary Wollstonecraft, with which Rich urges women to go against the grain if they want to see their existence within the patriarchal society. With this reference, Rich brings into the poem a woman that fought against the patriarchal discourse and rebelled against those men that wanted to keep women illiterate, which made men call her a harpy, shrew, and whore, as she says in lines from 73 to 76. She also refers to Diderot, a French philosopher, Rousseau, and John Milton.
Great. And what about irony?
Well, irony is seen in Fuller in different moments to illustrate how ridiculous it is for men to think that they are supposed to protect women when women can perfectly defend themselves without their help. As she mocks in the phrase, and I quote, "Let them be sea captains if they will. I do not doubt if there were a fair field they would be found in the navy quite as frequently as in the laundry." She gives the impression that this chivalry is false, and they just want to give an image of being more courageous than women are. Fuller, she also uses irony to criticize this romanticized view and the humanizing expectations that the patriarchal society has on women. She exaggerates the passivity and self-denial that men would expect from a woman in her time, but by using it with an ironic tone, she is opposing to this view. And overall, this irony is used to mock men and picture women as more intelligent than them. As for Adrienne Rich, she used irony for the same purposes as Margaret Fuller, mocking the oppressive roles and expectations that the patriarchal society had imposed on women. The speaker of the poem seems to know more than the reader does, which gives the speaker a right to use a more ironic tone. There is a subtle but firm irony which helps her develop a critical voice about the expected role of women in society. The poem moves between the immediate situation and the ironic commentary of the limitations of that situation. In the poem, she mixes the irony with a deep questioning of the situation. She wrote about the domestic situations of women's life, but with the use of irony, she encourages the reader to rethink about the absurdity of those rules and instances them to make a change in their lives to help the situation.
So, would you conclude that Adrienne Rich inspired her poem on Margaret Fuller's work?
Yeah, absolutely. As I have mentioned, by the use of, she depicted the same women that Margaret Fuller did. She tried to convey an image of women as equal to men, just like Fuller did. And yeah, I think both of them had the same purpose in their work, which is to demonize the patriarchal society that we live on, they were experiencing. And I think that Adrienne Rich inspired her poem in Margaret Fuller, but also in a lot of other feminist writers of the previous century. And yeah, they both used the same devices. Like, allusion is very, very clear in both works. They are mainly used to present their knowledge and demonstrate that intellectual capability and intellectual freedom that they both demanded in their works. So I think that they are very similar works in terms of purpose and topics and stylistic devices.
And the final question, would you say that these ideas that these women portrayed are still important in our society?
Well, absolutely. I think that we still live in a society that portrays women as somehow inferior to men. It's not as clear as in their centuries. Like in the 19th century, it was very, very clear that women were considered not even human beings. But yeah, I think it's still really necessary to demand that freedom and that intellectual freedom and demonstrate that we are as intelligent, as capable as men are, I think it may not seem as necessary today as it was, but it still is very, very, very important to demand our own position in society, and we are equal to men. So yeah.
And with that, we finish today's podcast. Congratulations on doing such a wonderful and interesting research, Daniela, and thank you for sharing it with us. And for the listeners, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye.